First, I just want to warn everybody that this lecture is going to talk about the harsh realities of warfare at times, which does include violence towards civilians. There are going to be images of some of the destruction that's been wrought during the war, and we're going to talk about it in a very frank way. So just be aware that if you don't feel that you're prepared to deal with some of that, then maybe this lecture just really isn't for you. But we have to talk about that stuff. If you try to sanitize your discussion of war, then you're not really understanding the realities of war. So we have to deal with that type of content. Also, it's natural when studying history to have subjective, moral, emotional reactions and opinions, reactions to and opinions about things. That is natural. And there are things you absolutely should have opinions on. When studying military history in particular, this is going to occur because you are dealing with some of the most violent and destructive actions that humans have inflicted upon one another, bar none. Especially the more periods of time you study, the more likely that is to be the case. However, when analyzing the past, and this is something historians take very seriously, we have to do what we can to set aside those moral sentiments, because if we don't, they're going to hamper our analysis. They're going to prevent us from looking at something in as unbiased a way as possible and performing sound, effective analysis of it. You should have moral opinions about a lot of these things. That's natural. There are a lot of things that moral analysis is going to bleed in no matter what you do. You just have to do what you can, especially in military affairs, to set that aside, or else the analysis that you provide is not going to be as effective as it could be otherwise. In fact, the more you allow that to bleed in, the more inaccurate your analysis is going to be. And if you really want to try to understand the Ukraine war, what happened, what's happening, and what potentially might happen in the future, you have to try to set that stuff aside as much as you can. But I want to be clear, because I think it's important to be clear. It is my strong opinion, first off, that the invasion of Ukraine is a war. It is a war. It is also an aggressive, unjustified act of international aggression undertaken by Russia under false pretenses. So they have given justifications for their invasion of Ukraine, and I believe that those justifications are unjustified. Moreover, I do believe that there is ample evidence that the Russian war crimes alleged by the Ukrainian government did occur. So that's my stance on those things. I want to make that clear before we go in. Also, keep in mind that when historians or political scientists or people in international relations, people in the government, when you hear current and former military personnel get on the television or whatever it might be and talk about what they think is happening in the war and going to happen in the war, they are making educated guesses based upon the information they have at hand at the time. And usually what ends up happening is that narrative and those understandings get revised as time passes. And my Vietnam War students know this in particular because we've talked a lot about how our understanding of the Vietnam War has changed over time and will continue to change. When we're talking about what's going on here, a lot of it is based upon contemporary understanding of events. A lot of it's based upon contemporary accounts and news reports and intelligence briefings. And I have a lot of colleagues who are in professional military education. We've spent a lot of time talking about what's going on, but a lot of this could change in the coming months or in the coming years. So important final thing to keep in mind there. So after we've provided those points, I just want to get that out of the way. Let's start talking about the background. My Vietnam War students will know what I always say when you're talking about studying a war. The first thing you need to do is talk about geography. It's essential to understand where a conflict is taking place. Ukraine is 233,000 square miles. It is a very large country, not a small country. It's a very large country. It has a population of 41.18 million and a GDP, we're talking pre-war here, of 164.52 billion. If we want to look at an equivalent Central or Western European country, you can look at France, roughly the same size. Also, if you think of the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, then that is actually almost exactly the same size as Ukraine, if we're talking about geographical size, to give you an idea. France's population, though, is bigger than the population of Ukraine. If we're looking at a comparison of Ukraine to Russia, then Russia, 6.6 million square miles. It's the biggest country in the world. But if you look at the population to size, it's actually fairly small, 144.4 million. The United States is about 3.8 million square miles, and we have a population of about 310 million, to give you an idea. So Russia, very big country, actually comparatively small population. Then if you look at GDPs, what you should notice is Ukraine, yes, does have a comparatively small GDP to other Central and Western European countries. But actually, if you look at Russia's GDP in comparison to other global power states, Italy's GDP, and we're talking all pre-war stats here, Italy's GDP is bigger than the GDP of Russia. And one of Italy's biggest produced goods is Nutella, okay? So you're dealing, if we're talking about Russia, very large country, comparatively small population, and economically actually not as big of a powerhouse as you might think. If you look at this map here, you can also see important geographical features. The country is laid out more east to west than north to south. You have this major river system that stretches north to south. You have the Crimean Peninsula down here in the south. Crimean Peninsula, historically incredibly important for any civilization that has existed around the Black Sea. The Crimean Peninsula has been an important feature to control. You have Kherson here just north of the Crimean Peninsula. You have the capital in the northern portion of the country. You've probably heard of the Kharkiv offensive. That's over here in the eastern portion of the country. Then if you look here in the far western portion of the country, you have Lviv. That's important too, and we'll talk about why in a moment. So always understand your geography. If you're looking at the physical features of the country, then you need to know that Ukraine is geographically very diverse. And because of its physical location, has access to several Eastern European countries, which is also why it's always been a very important region to control. If you want to control, the greater area of Eastern Europe, Western Asia, access to and potentially control of what is today Ukraine has been very, very important. It has several very important ports on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. As you should notice from this map on the top, topographically very diverse as well, and that's very important. So you notice it has lots of large plains with very fertile soil, and this is another reason why this region has historically been very, very important because of its agricultural production. It is one of the biggest agricultural producers in the world, to this day. It's actually what is often referred to as a breadbasket. This is a region of the world that produces so much that it is incredibly advantageous to have control of that production. They produce grain, corn, and sunflower seed oil, but as you can see from the list here, they produce a lot of other stuff. So this is why, if you've been following the news at all, then you've heard a lot of concern about the ability of production to continue and export of that to continue, because when you have a world producer that is going to vastly underproduce, that's immediately going to start impacting not developed nations, it's going to start impacting undeveloped nations or developing nations. They are the most vulnerable, and the potential for devastation there is increasing because of the war. If you look at the layout of that production, that's important too. What you should notice, the pink is where you have a mix, and that's why it says cereals on the list down here. Cereals means all kinds of stuff is produced there. It's not one particular crop or another. And one thing that you should take out of, first off, a lot of production across most of the country. Second thing you should notice is that if you look at the southeast of the country, then you have a lot of mixes of production and intense production in that region. So controlling in particular the southeast of the country, very important, along with Crimea itself, very important, and just south of the country too, really that whole strip in the south, incredibly important if you want to have access to that bountiful agricultural production that Ukraine is known for. In particular, the South is known for wheat production, but it's not specifically wheat production, as I said. It's a lot of different cereals are grown there. In the central portion of the country, that's where most of corn is grown, and a lot of that, not all of it, does go to China, so that's pretty significant. Something else, you have to look at planting seasons. If we talk about this war starting in late February, that was during the planting season for several very important crops in Ukraine. And then if we look at where the war has continued, as the war is continuing right now, that's also interrupting the planting seasons of wheat in particular, and then also the harvest season. It's interrupting that. So when you're talking about what this war is going to impact, you can't even just look at agricultural exports for this year. You have to look at how the war is going to disrupt agricultural exports for multiple years, because the war itself is disrupting planting and harvesting. They also are a big exporter of gas, timber, but lithium is one thing that Ukraine has started to get really active in exporting. They have the potential to be an enormous lithium exporter, and they are starting to get involved in that. And obviously, lithium is an up-and-coming global commodity. In terms of the ethnic breakdown of Ukraine, you have a notable disparity. Again, if we're talking about what's going on in the war, this is of particular interest. If you're talking about the ethnic breakdown of the Crimea and then the southern portion of the country and the southeastern portion of the country, that has a large distribution per capita of ethnic Russians. The rest of the country, predominantly ethnic Ukrainian, but that has had an enormous impact upon Russian presence there, then annexation, then the invasion. The country itself is a contrast between very rural and very urban and cosmopolitan. I think if you wanted an American equivalent, I've thought about this before. I think if you're talking about not geography as much, but if you're talking about climate, you're talking about agricultural production, and you're talking about very cosmopolitan urban centers, very rural parts of the country, think of like Wisconsin. I think that might be a good equivalent. So very cold winters, warm summers, produce some of the same agricultural goods, very, very cosmopolitan cities, but then you have very rural and lots of agricultural production. If we're talking about the history of Ukraine, now you might say, Dr. Douglas, we're here to talk about the war. Why are we going into all of this? You have to talk about the background of the war, and you have to talk about the background of the region, because all of this factors into why wars happen. You have to understand all of this, or the war is completely out of its context. The salient thing to know about this is that historically, there was a lot of different kingdoms and principalities, and eventually countries and nations that controlled the territory that became Ukraine. And it definitely changed over time, depending upon when we're talking about. What you should also notice is if you're comparing the control of these different powers, they often controlled huge portions of what today is Ukraine, but never all of what today is Ukraine. So if you're looking at all of these different countries and all of these different, again, kingdoms controlling this territory, changed hands quite a lot, depending upon when we're talking. Eventually, when you come to the 19th century, my 1212 students know that's when we're dealing with the emergence of really strong nationalism that led to the formation of a lot of quote unquote nations. That's when you start to see the emergence of, instead of a regional identity, a more firm Ukrainian national identity. Although if you look at the map, what you can see is that the Austro-Hungarian Empire notably controlled the western portion of the country. And because of that, Ukrainians fought on both sides of World War I against one another. You have this strong Russian influence tradition in Ukraine, but then there's also part of Ukraine that has a strong Central and even Western European influence. After World War I, once the Soviet Union was formed, then you have the formation of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Under the Soviets, they created a singular Ukrainian state, but because it was in the Soviet system, I wouldn't say it's quite accurate to say that there was quote unquote nationalism in that sense, because it was a Soviet system. So they very much wanted to promote Ukrainian identity, but Ukrainian sort of state socialist identity within the greater Soviet identity. So not really nationalism, if we're going to be careful about our terms. Ukraine, like a lot of parts of Eastern Europe, suffered quite mightily at the hands of the Germans in World War II, and even before that, under the Soviets. When the Soviets took over all of that territory, they instituted a bunch of purely and extremely disastrous land reforms that led to an outrageous famine that swept through all of Eastern Europe. We're talking tens of millions of people dying in this famine and in the political crackdown of Soviet control. Probably 6 to 10 million Ukrainians alone died, particularly in Ukraine, because what happened is, being the breadbasket that it was, the Soviets used production there and exported as much as they could elsewhere. And that led to pretty extreme famine in Ukraine. The region did improve into the 1920s and 1930s, because Ukraine in particular was a place that the Soviets heavily industrialized, the Ukrainians industrialized, because of its geographical location, because historically the population was always very well educated. That made them ripe for industrialization. So Ukraine, vis-a-vis the rest of the Soviet Union, became comparatively quite industrialized in the 1920s and 1930s because of all of its advantageous characteristics. The Ukrainians fought, or a vast majority of them, fought with the Soviets against the Germans in World War II. The capital was occupied from 1941 to 1943. This picture here on the top is a picture of the capital after heavy bombing raids in World War II. 35,000 towns and cities in Ukraine were destroyed during World War II. What this entrenched is a incredibly viscerally strong anti-Nazi sentiment in any Soviet territory, by the way, but Ukraine being one of the regions in particular. In the United States, we are very, I would say, generally proud of fighting in World War II to suppress Nazism. American civilians, however, did not have to experience that visceral connection to the war, in the sense that we didn't have them occupying our towns and cities, extracting people all the time and sending them to prison or concentration camps, or just executing them. We didn't have our cities destroyed, and we should be very proud of our contribution, but we didn't have that visceral personal reaction. So whenever anybody in politics in this part of the world invokes Nazism, anti-Nazism, and uses that in their propaganda, take the American reaction to the idea of fascism and Nazism and then amplify that to an unbelievable extreme. And that's why that rhetoric is so powerful. It's because of this history. And what you should also notice from this map on the bottom is, again, that western chunk, historically not part of that original territory. That's why some portions of that country actually allied with the Nazis, in the sense that they were nationalists and not communists or socialists. By the 1960s, Ukraine became a leader in Eastern Europe in terms of, again, produced goods because of that history of industrialization by the 60s, weapons technology, and of course, nuclear power. That's how you have the establishment of the Chernobyl power plant, and then the resulting meltdown that took place there. That did not happen in Russia, that was in Ukraine. Once all of the Soviet states began pushing for independence starting in 1989, Ukraine was one of those. They began really a hard push for independence in 1990, and then it was firmly and formally established in 1991. Now, again, I'm just going to hit the high points here, but the entirety of Eastern Europe and Russia went through severe economic depression at the end of the Cold War, because all of those economies had to go from a Soviet economy, so not nationalized, internationalized, Soviet bloc economies, state-run, to at least some of it being private-run. That process was never going to be easy. It was never going to lead to immediate economic prosperity. There was just no way for that to be the case. And so the depression that resulted impacted that part of the world incredibly severely. Things did start to improve in the early 2000s. The leaders of Ukraine, just because Ukraine broke away from the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union collapsed, does not mean that the administration in those countries suddenly became markedly anti-Russian. In fact, a lot of the government individuals that remained in the Ukrainian government after the fall of the Soviet Union had been part of the Soviet system. And so you have these governments that, although they've broken away and they want independence and they want to institute free market, in terms of global influence, they're far closer to Russia than they are to, say, Central and Western Europe or the United States. And so you see this vacillation in terms of the political officials in Ukraine from being maybe moving towards the EU and NATO, which was the big thing, more NATO, I would say, than the EU, and then moving back towards Russia. Things really started to change in 2013 when a series of protests took place against the government because they didn't like the government's pro-Russian stances. In 2014, the president was removed, markedly pro-Russian president was removed. There were a series of elections, and if you remember the ethnic breakdown of Ukraine, then this vote should make a lot of sense of the people that want to institute this new government that was going to move away from Russia. Portions of the country that you have less history of presence of Russians and Russian settlement, lower percentage of support for that move, higher percentages of support for that move in other portions of the country. This is when Putin pushed for the annexation of Crimea. You can read about the annexation. It was bloodless. If we're talking about motivations for Putin's invasion, why he thought he could invade and not have a problem, the global reaction to what happened in Crimea is a big reason for that. So when it was very clear that the new government in Ukraine was going to start moving towards the EU, maybe start moving towards NATO, but more the EU, then he had Russian soldiers start seizing weapons from Ukrainian soldiers, start taking over government offices. They held the referendum vote. It was likely not a fair vote in terms of everybody feeling they could come out and vote as they chose, although there's been a lot written, a lot debated about that. The result was the annexation of Crimea. And the rest of the world, although they verbally denounced it and instituted some sanctions on Russia, didn't really do too much about it. This was preceded by a series of uprisings, if we want to use counterinsurgency talk, a series of insurgencies that rose up in the Donbass, which is this region in the east. You have the pro-Russian and Russian populations rise up there, and they established independent territories, so they claimed, and started to take control. And so you had an insurgency that emerged there where the Ukrainian government was suppressing it. And this is where you have urban warfare, where the line between warfare and crime tends to be a matter of perspective. It tends to be a matter of opinion. Is this crime or is this some type of revolutionary activity? Is this an insurgency? How can you react to that? Pretty violent fighting there. A lot of it was actually led by several figures who were former Russian FSB, which is their equivalent of essentially the FBI. But the FSB was formerly most of the FSB was formerly the KGB. I'm sure you've heard of the KGB. So some went into that region. They participated, if not led, some of these movements. And that's how you have that area that's basically occupied by Russian power before this war even starts. Fighting there was quite violent. It was, again, this very difficult dynamic for the Ukrainian government. Is it crime? Is it some type of revolution? How do we deal with this? If you're interested in this, there was a Vice reporter that went there. I think he was there for about 6 months and just went around and did reports on what was going on there. And it's a whole series on YouTube. So if you're interested in that, it's worth taking a look at. If we're talking about Russia, so you have to understand both sides here. I'm going to go through this, as I said, pretty quick. Russia, very, very bad economically at the end of the Cold War because of this need to shift the economy, which was not easy. The hope was that everyday people would start investing in businesses and that you would start to have this easy shift from state run to private run. But unfortunately, that's not how it worked, because corrupt members of the government in a lot of places stayed in the government, and they used their positions to leverage more economic power. And this is how you have the emergence of oligarchs. I'm sure you've heard mention in the news about oligarchs. Oligarchs are people that when the Soviet Union fell, the Russian government gave every Russian vouchers, and they could use these vouchers to buy stock in companies. And these oligarchs, a lot of them members of the former Soviet government, had amassed a lot of wealth through corruption. They had cash. So what they said to Russians is, you give me your voucher for stocks, which is going to be something worth something down the road. It's not worth something to you now because these businesses aren't producing for you yet. I'll buy it for cash. And a lot of people who were economically disadvantaged, they needed the money to survive, said, yeah, I'll give you these stocks, give me the cash. And this led to the very, very rapid amassment of control of these companies in the hands of comparatively a very small number of people. These are the oligarchs. These are the people that dominate Russian business to this day. And that's how they have so much debated political sway, is because they are former members of the government, or they had through corruption amassed a lot of wealth of power in the Soviet system. They buy these businesses and they control them. If we're talking about what happened in the 90s, things actually got even worse. Poverty increased, the economy got even worse. Russia did take out an IMF loan. They defaulted on the loan. That didn't help, certainly. So Boris Yeltsin, who had been championed in the 90s as this beacon of liberalism in Russia, in this former Soviet power, started to become incredibly unpopular because of this economic suffering that seemed even worse than the economy had been under the Soviet system. Life expectancy decreased, a lot of people left the country, and that is how you have the rise of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin was a member of the KGB. He was in intelligence. His primary station was in Germany, so he's fluent in German. He became part of the FSB after the Soviet Union fell. If you look at profiles of Putin, because to understand this war, we have to talk about Putin. That's where he cut his teeth. And in that late Soviet, early post-Cold War system, the strong survived. The way I often describe Putin is that he's an alpha junkyard dog. The only way to survive in that cutthroat system is to be ruthless, to exert power, or at the very least exude power. That is how he rose up through the ranks, is by doing that. What happened is that when it became time for Yeltsin Yeltsin resigned, then Putin had worked his way up to be his number two. So Putin became the president. He served 2 terms. There was a rule in place that presidents could only serve 2 terms. He went in a power sharing mood with Medvedev. If you listen to the news, you hear him talk quite a lot. He's very bellicose, talking in particular about nuclear war recently. They had a power sharing agreement where he became president, Putin became prime minister. They changed the law. Putin was reelected, and now they've changed the law so that if he chooses to do so, Putin could continue to run to 2032. He is not a socialist in the sense that he wants to recreate the socialist system. He's an imperialist revanchist. And revanchism is the idea that you want to reintegrate territory into your country that was lost, and you believe that territory is yours. He's not a socialist. He's not a communist. He's best thought of as an imperialist revanchist. He wants to control other countries. He wants to dominate them in terms of their international diplomacy, their political decisions. He wants them to be tools of the Russian Empire. That's a better way to think of him. He also wants to restore the great power status of the Soviet Union, the idea that other countries around the world, particularly the United States, were afraid, quote unquote, of the Soviet Union. That's the power he wants. He doesn't want the Soviet Union. He wants, and essentially, some of the trappings of it. These revanchist moves began under Yeltsin. So Putin's not unique in that sense. He did, at least claimed, of course, we know there's obviously been problems with that, supposedly instituted military reform, went to war against Chechnya. If you want to know why Chechnya is fighting in the war, at least they were. It's because the Russians engaged in a revanchist war in Chechnya and inflicted massive, massive devastation on Chechnya. They did the same in Georgia. Russia has been moving to establish closer trade ties with China. A lot of his rhetoric is about NATO's threat to Russian sovereignty and Russian bloc sovereignty. If you want to know why some Russians have refused to speak out against him and are convinced that he's a good leader, a lot of it is because under him there was economic recovery. That's just a fact. The GDP increased, the life expectancy increased. There were a lot of laws instituted that made it harder to leave the country. They stopped, for example, there was a program in the 90s to adopt children in Russian foundling homes. That was ended. So one of the ways that he has been able to exert power over his neighbors is the exportation of energy, particularly gas. So there's been a lot about this in the news, as I'm sure you've heard. But the truth of the matter is that Russia is not as economically strong as it seems. It certainly did improve in the early 2000s and into the 2010s, but wealth is held in a comparatively small number of hands. And those who don't hold wealth have a very low standard of living overall, if we're talking about European averages and, let's say, averages to the United States. The political system is also very, very corrupt. What that means is that although Putin projects Russia as this global power, a lot of it is bluff, a lot of it is bluster, and a lot of it is because they have nuclear weapons. They're a nuclear power, and so they use that to exert control. So if we're talking about the war, the question is, why is Russia losing this war, and how is Ukraine winning this war? It might seem unfair to ask, why is Russia losing? But before this war, the vast majority of people, including myself, assumed that Russia would easily defeat Ukraine in any type of land conflict. Russia's much larger. They've touted a modern military. They tout modern weaponry. And although we're going to talk about Ukraine updating, Ukraine, as you can see from these numbers, the numbers are pretty telling, at least if you look initially. And this is why I've said to my Vietnam War students, war is not a numbers game. You can't look at these numbers and say, well, the one side is way bigger than the other side, so the outcome of this war is predetermined. Yeah, throughout history, eight times out of 10, maybe that's true. This is one of those times it's not. And this is a perfect example of why war is not a numbers game. You can't just look at number of soldiers. You can't just look at number of planes and say, well, the one side has way more than the other side, so they're obviously going to win. That's not really how it works. So why is Russia losing, and how is Ukraine winning? The reality is that the reason Russia is losing is, one, they're a paper tiger. That's a phrase that military historians use to refer to armies or militaries that look better on paper than they are in reality. They're bigger on paper. They have more technological capability on paper. They have more tactical and operational ability on paper than they do in reality. Most militaries are paper tigers to some degree. As we've seen, Russia is quite a significant paper tiger. Two, they have an outdated staff and command system. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Three, they have a weak economy, as I just explained. And four, they have comparatively little concern for the sovereignty and importance of the individual. Now, that may seem unfair. My 12-12 students, we've talked about the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution before that and the Renaissance before that. Remember, that developed this sense of the importance of the individual, that the individual is sovereign, that political systems are beholden to the people, just like the people have a duty to work for and support and listen to the government, that it's a two-way street. And that created in parts of the world that adhered to Enlightenment ideology, a more defined sense of self and the sovereignty and the agency of the self. That had an impact on military affairs. If you look at Russia compared to that, they did not really, on the population level, imbibe a lot of that into the 20th century, even before that, really. So, what that has led to historically is that Russia has an incredibly high tolerance for casualties because the blunt reality is they care less about losing individuals than other countries comparatively that have more of that tradition of the sovereignty and the importance of the individual. And so Russians have, in wars historically, suffered astronomical casualties and kept fighting because they have more of a tolerance for it because of these deep cultural attitudes. One reason why a lot of people thought that Russia would dominate very quickly is that in a lot of the Western world, Central Western Europe, the United States, the British Commonwealth, et cetera, started to look at the Russian military as an equivalent of the US military. It is not, okay? Even, again, war's not a numbers game, but Russia annually spends $43 billion on defense, the United States $738 billion. I don't care how good your scientists are, I don't care how effective your military is, you are not an equivalent if you have that massive disparity in spending. If we're talking about the size of the Russian military, technically you're talking about 900,000 total, maybe up to 1 million total. In the army, that translates to about 280,000 active troops. As we've seen, that's not really the case. Their active force is actually smaller than that. Compared to the invasion force of Ukraine was 140,000. Something that also has been key. In the United States, we have a reserve system. So if the government needs reserves, there are active reserves and there are inactive reserves, and there's lots of classifications of reserves. And if the government needs reserves to come fight, they have a system in place, they call them up, they have places where they go, and they quickly construct the apparatus to get those people where they need to go to integrate into the active duty military and deploy. Russia has no structured reserve system. So when the Russian government said, we're going to call up reserves, that's why if you have been following this closely, you might have seen videos online of people just standing in fields around bonfires because they had to put them in empty fields. They have no buildings to put them in. They have no supply infrastructure waiting for them to acquire to then go deploy. So if that invasion force fails, there's no structured reserve system behind it to keep the fighting going. To give you an idea of comparison, the US military has 1.3 active duty soldiers. The invasion force of Kuwait in 1991, 540,000. The invasion force of Ukraine, 140,000. So just give you an idea of some of these numbers. So staff systems. I know, we'll get to the war, I promise. This is all very important. It all makes the war make sense. If you talk about all this, then the war itself makes a whole lot more sense, I promise. The United States and Western countries have a different staff system than Russia and countries of its historical tradition. In the US and Western staff system, the commander has a staff. It's a group of people that work for him or her that help them do their job, okay? When it comes to making decisions, this is the decision-making process. The commander goes to their staff and they say, here is the information I've been given by my superior officers. Here's the information I have from intelligence in terms of what I understand the current situation is. And they have a goal they need to achieve, and they have a conversation with their staff and say, this is what I want to achieve. Now we need to come up with a plan, or I need to come up with a plan with your assistance to achieve this goal. The staff then goes out, they collect information, they collate information about troop capability, where different units are, what the geography is, what the current situation is in combat as they understand it, et cetera, all that stuff. They come back to the commander, they present that information, and then the commander, in conjunction with the staff, providing, when I say feedback, I don't mean feedback in the sense that they would blatantly tell a commander they're making a bad decision necessarily, but feedback in the sense that if the commander says something that they know to be untrue, they provide the feedback to correct that misunderstanding about true position, geography, available material, et cetera, et cetera. And then the commander comes up with a series of possibilities. And then through oftentimes a dialogue, at least of some kind, a decision is then made, and then the staff takes that decision and they go execute it. So it is a two-way street. Again, I'm not saying that means staffs can, you aren't going to have a colonel tell a general, that's a really bad idea, unless they have a particular relationship for that or the commander's open to that. And different commanders operated their staffs and have operated their staffs in very different ways. But the idea is that it's a feedback loop, because one person, the thinking is, can't do all of that themselves. They can't collect all of that information, collate all of that information, and then make informed decisions because it's just one person. That's the thinking. You need a staff to help do all of that. My 1212 students, you learned about Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great's one of the people that contributed to the creation of this system. Napoleon is too. And then it was refined after that. And this is the system that the United States and Western countries now have in place. That's not the Russian system. It's one direction. The commander has a plan that he or she wants carried out. And they come up with most of the particulars for the carrying out of that plan. They give the plan to their staff. And then the staff's job is to turn the commander's vision into executable orders as rapidly as possible. They are not to provide feedback. They are not to have a dialogue. It is a one-way conversation. And usually staffs are, in most systems where staffs start to become important, you're talking about staffs of, say, lieutenant colonels and colonels, maybe captains, and your commanders are generals. So what that means is that the people that are making all of the substantive decisions in this system about operations, they're at the general level, usually. The benefits of the Russian system, you might say, well, you need that dialogue. Well, the Russian system's fast. It operates really fast, and you don't have to have that feedback loop, which can take time. It doesn't require intensive training because you don't want your lower level officers and your enlisted to think on their own. That's not their job. Their job's to follow orders in that system. So they get an order, they execute it. This is really good for systems that you don't have a lot of time to train. You don't have a lot of money to support a standing military because you don't need that time. They show up, they learn how to handle weapons, they're given orders, and they carry them out. And you can fall back on superior numbers, very sadly, when the system starts to break down. The benefits of the US system is that this can drastically increase the effectiveness of a commander because it's not one brain, it's multiple brains thinking at the same time. It's highly adaptable because you're constantly reassessing the situation. You're constantly changing the plan based upon updates of what's going on in battle. It trains officers down the hierarchy. So say if you start losing generals, they can easily, or at least more easily, be replaced because a lot of the people that end up getting promoted have either worked in staffs or have had staffs of their own. So they understand the process, and promotion and continuation of operations is much easier. Officers down the hierarchy further are also trained in what we call combined arms, which is where you learn how to integrate infantry and armor and artillery and air. Integrating that stuff successfully is what makes for successful operations in modern warfare. And in the US and Western system, officers further down the scale are taught how to do that because they are trained in these staff systems. Also, in the US Western staff system, there is a whole cadre of soldiers that's totally dedicated to logistics, which is the organization of supply and manpower. Wars are won by good logistics, and they are lost by bad logistics. The US system does have its weaknesses, okay? You have to have officers that are willing to take feedback in a system like that. Not all systems are willing to have officers that are willing to have subordinate officers provide them with feedback. And again, I'm not saying that feedback means, sir, ma'am, you're wrong. It's usually, I think maybe we should revise this plan because of this new intel that's come in. From the Russian point of view, they think this system, it's weak. They think it's hesitant. They think it is far too risk averse because you're constantly adapting, in part to avoid casualties. And the Russians think that delay is far too risk averse to be effective. It also requires extensive training. These systems are really, really hard to put in place. And if anybody knows anything about the US military, then you should know they spend a lot of their time training, because it's not easy to have a system like this. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of time, and thus it takes a lot of money. It's very hard, and a lot of countries adopt it, but not everybody does. The Russian system's weaknesses. Yes, it's faster, but if the initial plan fails, it's very hard to adapt, because most of your soldiers have not been taught to adapt. It's not their job to adapt. They are actually encouraged not to. They're given a plan and they follow it. Officers further down the scale are not trained in combined arms warfare. So if you lose a general, you don't necessarily have a colonel that knows how to do that. They do not know how to adapt. They do not know how to improvise, because they're not supposed to. They're told not to, because they are given a plan to carry out. What this means overall is that it's easier, but it's less adaptable. The US system, it's harder, but it is more adaptable. So that's the trade-off. There's always trade-offs of any system. There's no perfect system. The Western staff system, it's slower, it's hard to learn, it's hard to manage, it's hard to be able to have officers that are willing to take that type of feedback, and it takes a long time to teach people how to do it. However, it is more adaptable, whereas the Russian system's faster, far less adaptable. How's Ukraine winning then? Well, in 2014, Ukraine started training with NATO forces, primarily US forces, but not exclusively so, in Western Ukraine. And they have adopted a NATO and US style staff system. They've adopted NATO and US style training methods, regimentation, and they began updating their military hardware with $2.4 billion in military aid since 2014. They've adapted and adopted our system, the Western system more generally. That has allowed for a lot of the adaptation that we're seeing. It's not only that, but that's a big part of it. So why did Russia decide to invade now? Well, obviously, Putin, I won't talk about all of these again. Putin, he's a revanchist. He wants all of these former territories under his control. He thinks that the rest of the world wasn't going to do anything about it, because the rest of the world didn't do anything about Crimea. So he had no expectation that anybody in the international community was going to intervene if he sent an army into Ukraine. He also saw the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and therefore his estimation of US willingness to intervene in any way was drastically lowered also because of that. And he thinks, frankly, that the West is weak. There were a series of allegations, none of which have any credible evidence to support them, let's be clear. He alleged that the Ukrainians were undertaking genocidal activity in the Donbass to control that territory. He alleged the Ukrainians were Nazis, again, invoking that Nazi propaganda language. He alleged that there were and are labs in Ukraine working with the United States to develop biological weapons, against no credible evidence to support any of this. Let's be very clear. All that being said, it's very easy to dismiss Putin. People might say he's crazy. People might say he's a psychopath, all of these things, call him a monster. I think that language is very, very dangerous to use, because when you start talking about historical and obviously living figures that way, I think it's an attempt for humans to separate themselves in some type of comfort way. Like, that's a monster. I could never be like that. We share no similarities. It's a distancing tactic, I think. Putin is perfectly rational. He's very smart and he's perfectly rational. The best comment I heard from a British analyst, actually, is Putin is perfectly rational. People just think rational means nice. Rational doesn't mean nice. He's very rational. He knows what he's doing. He knows he has to keep winning to stay in power. Again, he's the alpha junkyard dog. He's gotten to where he is by being ruthless, by exerting power. And to stay where he is, he has to keep doing that. And the invasion of Ukraine is part of that. He was also likely misled about the strength of his military. If you have a corrupt political system, you're likely also going to have a corrupt military system, which means that you can have members of the military telling you, yes, these tanks are great and they work really well. Yes, these weapons are incredibly effective. Yes, all of our training is going very well and the soldiers are ready for this invasion, when all of that is not actually true, because people down the hierarchy of the military have no incentive to be honest. they have every incentive to lie, not only to line their own pockets, but to keep their own positions. That situation feeds sycophancy. So what it leads to is people saying, yes, everything's great, everything's fine. These new tanks work, these new weapons work. Not, by the way, I think we have a really big problem with this tank system that we think is going to stop any type of ground artillery. So maybe we need to not invade and think about it. That person's not going to rise through the ranks. So the system disincentivizes honesty. So that probably meant that he did not have an accurate understanding of the actual quality of his military, nor the actual quality of the Ukrainian military when he decided to invade. If you want to read a really good article about the invasion of Ukraine, I really recommend you read this article, The Ragtag Army That Won the Battle of Kyiv and Saved Ukraine. It's a great article. It has a lot of really interesting detail about people, everyday people just picking up arms to support the invasion. The invasion was meant to be swift. It was meant to be done in 2 to 3 days. The Russians were going to storm south to the capital, take the capital. You take the capital, then you can arrest, kick out, imprison, maybe liquidate members of the government, and you install your own leader. Country falls in a few days. And by the way, this is pretty standard throughout history. The way to conquer a country is you take their capital. That's what the Germans did with France in World War II. Get to Paris, take Paris, country falls. Pretty standard operating procedure there. That's what they wanted to do. However, once they reached the capital itself, they immediately faced stauncher resistance than they had expected, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Because of that staunch resistance, that plan that had been put in place fell apart. Why didn't the Russians adapt? Because their system does not allow them to adapt easily. And that's exactly what happened. When military historians talk about wars, they often talk about decisive points. And not necessarily turning points. I wouldn't describe these as turning points in the sense that the war was going one way, then it immediately shifted the other way. But these are benchmarks. These are decisive points. The first decisive point in the invasion was that Ukrainian soldiers, and actually some civilians who took up arms to help, held this airport north of town. And this is key because the Russians were trying to fly in lots of reserve troops into the airport and not bring them over land. But the Ukrainians were able to shoot down a lot of aircraft on their way to get to the airport. They were able to shoot down or destroy a lot of aircraft trying to land at the airport. And they held the airport long enough and inflicted enough damage that the Russians became immediately adverse to the idea of bringing soldiers in through the air, which means the Russians had to start bringing in supplies and manpower primarily on the ground, and that did not go well either. So what you can see with this moving map is the Russians start advancing at the end of February. By March 2nd, they are in the outskirts of the capital itself, and they hit a wall. And the first decisive point was the airport. Second decisive point is the Ukrainians held important bridges. My Vietnam War students, we talked about the bridge into Saigon. Same thing is you have the military and some civilians. That's why I recommend reading that article. It talks about civilians. One man worked at the Ukrainian equivalent of a Home Depot and knew how to work drones and went out and helped blow up this bridge and some dams. The Ukrainians held these bridges, preventing the Russians from using the bridges to get over the various waterways and get into the capital itself. When they couldn't hold the bridges anymore, they blew up some of the bridges, as you're seeing here. That is a last gasp effort, but it works. You prevent the enemy army from advancing. That's what the Ukrainians did. Number 3, and I give this man a lot of credit for this, President Zelensky stayed in Ukraine. 2 to 3 days into the invasion, the United States was offering to evacuate him and his family and the key members of the government who would have been arrested. I actually, from what I understand, and I can't confirm this, this is alleged, I believe there were also some squads that had been sent into the capital in the middle of the night to find him and assassinate him. So it would have been in his best personal interest to leave the country at that point. Because remember, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days into the invasion, most people in the world think this is going to be very fast and the country is going to fall quickly. That even though there's a little bit of resistance, the Russians are going to overcome it eventually and the country's going to fall. But he stayed. He decided to stay. Whether or not that was performative, whether or not it was genuine, it does not matter. Because he stayed, it allowed the Ukrainian people to have a national rallying point around him. If he had left, then morale would have collapsed. And morale is one of those things about an army, a military, you can't predict and you can't control. It is really, really difficult to turn things around also. If morale is bad, it's really hard to make morale good again. If morale is good, it actually can become bad very, very quickly. So decisive point is he decided to stay. And that rallied a lot of Ukrainians behind the war effort who had previously maybe been more neutral, had not necessarily wanted to pick up arms. You know, they didn't like the invasion, but maybe they didn't want to pick up arms and participate. And I think that was a decisive point in the sense that he became a rallying point for Ukrainian resistance and Ukrainian nationalism. Next decisive point is that they decided to blow up some dams and blow up some water channels to flood this territory on the northwest side of the capital. If you've ever studied the Third Anglo-Dutch War, the Dutch do this when the French are trying to march on Dutch territories. They flood their own land. That's what happened here, is they blew up some dams and it led to flooding. You can see here on these maps. And tanks can't, you can see this field here on the bottom left, or the river that's been overrun, its banks have been overrun here on the right. You're not getting tanks through that. You're not getting armored personnel carriers through that. And that very much stopped the advance even further than the resistance already had. It was very, very effective. So what you can see is that the Russians use roadways to get south. They eventually do take the airport, but they have already shied away from air support by this point. And they try to flank the capital. Through this flanking maneuver, you have the Ukrainians stop their attempts to flank the capital and get into the capital itself. And again, that's through blowing bridges, that's through causing flooding, and that is through incredibly staunch ground resistance by both Ukrainian military and volunteers who have just taken up arms and are preventing the Russians from advancing. And the reason that the Russians can't regroup and figure out something new is because their system doesn't allow it. Keep in mind that this war, it's not what Putin wanted. Putin thought this would be over quickly, as most people did. It's also not what the Russian military expected. We know from accounts that the Russians did not build a logistical system that was meant to support any type of long-term invasion. So when you launch a forward defensive operation, ideally you launch an attack and then you have a logistical network that's going to be constructed behind it to support the troops in their advance. Russians didn't do any of that because they didn't think they needed to. They also didn't distribute their troops or their command structure to prepare for a long war. We know that because some of the personnel carriers that were destroyed that the Ukrainians looked through, they had parade uniforms in them. Some of the advanced Russian forces that were the earliest to get to the capital, they were military police because they expected to get to the capital would fall, and then they were going to have a military parade celebrating the conquering. So you don't have an advanced force of elite troops. You have military police and you have soldiers with parade uniforms. They also didn't appoint a single theater commander. There wasn't one person in control of the military making all of the decisions. And remember, the Russian command system is such that you need one person in control making the decisions because people at the lower levels are not empowered nor are they trained to make independent decisions. But because the Russians thought it would be fast, there was not one commander put in charge. There were about 6 different commanders in charge of different zones of the offensive. So about a month into the invasion, there wasn't one person in control, and that does not make for effective decision making. Because of their heavy losses in the air, and I'm talking heavy losses in the air, I think estimates 10,000 casualties in 48 hours, through attempted air transport. Supplies were limited to narrow roads. These roads were very easy to ambush. The Russians didn't know the territory as well as the Ukrainians do. It's not their country. In a situation like that, the operational wherewithal is on the part of the defenders. The Russian answer to all of this was just throw more stuff at it, throw more supplies, throw more manpower. So they quickly overloaded the road systems that couldn't get stuff because the front was stopped because the front of the columns couldn't advance. So that caused these traffic jams. And eventually the trucks ran out of fuel and their batteries died and they had to sit. The Russians have no night capability. They also had a supposedly very advanced encryption system that used 3G cell phone towers. But in an effort to prevent the Ukrainians from communicating, soldiers that were the advanced troops into Ukraine were told, destroy 3G cell phone towers. So the Russians, in effect, destroyed their own ability to communicate using encrypted communication lines. So commanders had to start buying cell phones and calling one another on cell phones. We have been listening to everything they've been saying since basically 24 hours into the attack. They're calling it's called in the clear. People have known not to do this since radios were invented. It's not good to communicate in the clear. Again, there was also no one commander making decisions. And a month into the campaign, the Ukrainians had been able to kill anywhere from 7 to 12 high-ranking Russian either colonels or generals. Remember the staff system. You have to have someone at the very top making decisions. If they're knocked out, that system is not built to quickly replace them because people aren't trained to do that. So when you start losing high-ranking generals who are the decision makers, you are creating chaos because the military can't adapt because it's not taught to adapt. The Ukrainians were also operating in small improvised squads. You would have small groups of soldiers. They were given a mission, or they were told just go out and find Russians and attack them and keep them from advancing. Because soldiers had been taught to improvise, think for themselves, operate in small squads, that's what they did. You also had civilians who were willing to take up arms and do that. The story in that article I told everyone to read talks about how they went to local stores and just found anything they could that they could make flammable or blow up. And they got commercial drones and were flying commercial drones around to find the Russians and attack them. The United States has also been providing active intelligence throughout the entire thing. The United States didn't admit that until about 4 or 5 weeks into the war. We were saying, well, we're providing them passive intelligence. So intelligence about things that have already happened. But no, we're providing them with active intelligence. When the advance stalled, Russian supplies quickly began to run out. There was one road, 40-mile-long convoy, completely stopped. And the best description I heard of it was a 40-mile-long POW camp the Ukrainians didn't have to feed. Just trucks upon trucks upon trucks sitting on this road, couldn't move. And the soldiers were running out of supplies because no supply network had been established because they didn't think they would need it. The advance stalled and everything just quickly fell apart. The Russians immediately began losing lots of supplies. Now, something actually my own mother asked me, why didn't they just go off-road? They didn't go off-road because of something that is very famous in this part of the world, and that's called Ratsbutitsa. These are pictures from World War II, as you can see. This is Ratsbutitsa. So the ground freezes because it gets very cold in the winter. And then when the ground falls and there's rain in the spring, that creates really, really ridiculously thick mud. And that mud is so famous for being difficult to get through. It's called general mud. That's what Ratsbutitsa means. And the idea is that it's a weapon in and of itself. So you might say, well, why didn't the trucks just go off-road? Or why didn't the tanks just go off-road? An average US tank is 30 tons. Russian tanks either a little bit lighter or a little bit heavier. 30 tons. You're not getting 30 tons through that. Look, this picture on the bottom, that's a wagon with horses, and they're sunk in the mud. Ratsbutitsa, I mean, it has its own name. So because the invasion was in late February, Ratsbutitsa sets in right in March into April. So as the logistical trains stalled and as these roads got overloaded, it became less possible for any of the heavy armor supply or the trucks to go off road around it because they'd sink right in the mud. Some tried, and we have pictures of them stuck in the mud. You can't just go off road, not with heavy armor like this. And you need heavy armor to break a stalemate. Also, last but not least, can't forget this, the Ukrainians have the will to fight. They have something to fight for, something that they believe in, and you can never discount that. Again, that's one of those intangibles of war, is the will to fight, the esprit du corps, if we want to use the fancy French term. The Ukrainians have that. The Russians don't, not really, especially not now. There were basic tactical and operational failures that the Russians kept committing over and over and over again, demonstrating their complete lack of adequate training, even in basic operational art. And there's innumerable videos on YouTube that demonstrate this. This is one famous one that made the news very early on, is you have this armored column that's attempting one of those flanking maneuvers to get into the capital and just not moving through enemy territory the right way, not observing what's around them, easily ambushed. The commander was killed. We have recordings from soldiers in this convoy on the way back to their base saying, we just have no idea what to do. Our commander was killed, because they're not trained to think independently. Just basic operational failures. This, I could give a whole hour lecture on this alone. This was the Moskva. This was a very important ship. One of the most important ships in the Russian Black Sea Fleet was struck, and it actually did sink. The degree of failure that is represented, basic training failure, technological failure, operational failure that this represents, is quite staggering for a modern, supposedly elite military. The other significant element of it is that it was a big propaganda coup for the Ukrainians. The sinking of this battleship that is meant to be, again, one of the most elite vessels of the Black Sea Fleet. The Ukrainians are also fighting smart. It's not that they're fighting hard, although they are. They're fighting smart, which means that they're moving around in small groups. They have not been taking unnecessary risks, particularly during the defense of the capital. They are taking advantage of the technology they have. They're using drones. A lot of people are going to stores and they're buying drones, and they're using internet capability to communicate effectively. They're using apps on phones to talk to one another. It also helps that they're receiving a lot of material internationally. The United States is providing them with more military aid than all of the other countries combined, also quite a lot of humanitarian aid. That being said, the Ukrainians are making the most of everything they have been given. They are, as I said, fighting smart. They are also fighting hard. They are fighting to preserve the sovereignty of their country. Someone could write a whole PhD on this, honestly. Drones have been incredibly decisive in this conflict. Drones for observation, drones for attack. That article I talked about that you should read, a lot of it is about drone operators who are 3D printing stuff independently so that they can use drones to spot, to track, and to attack Russian positions. There are also these, you might have heard of the kamikaze drones. This is a type of drone here in the top center. It's a disposable in the sense that it finds a target and it hits the target and blows up. You don't retrieve it. Other types of drones that are bigger and more expensive deploy ordnance and then you get the drone back. This drone here on the left, this is a high-grade consumer drone that people have 3D printed parts on to be able to release bombs that they drop. And there are a near infinite number of videos on YouTube of people deploying munitions that way. I would say one of the most powerful tools that the Ukrainians have utilized with impressive expertise, it's amazing how well they have utilized this, is social media, is public opinion. They are in the zeitgeist. Zeitgeist is a fancy word for a popular cultural trend, essentially. And it became the popular thing to support Ukraine. And I don't say that to diminish it. I'm saying that because people got behind Ukraine, governments then felt that it was politically advantageous to get behind Ukraine. And that has led to international aid, that's led to military support, that's led to economic sanctions, that's led to a lot of international pressure not to do business with Russia, not to positive relations with Russia. All of that has negatively impacted the Russian war effort in a vast myriad of ways and helped the Ukrainian war effort. This Fedorov, he is the minister for Ukraine, and he has a title I don't remember exactly. He's the one that's basically in charge of social media for the Ukrainian government. And he is constantly on Twitter, and he has been the one to help get a lot of the donation of the Starlink satellites, the Starlink terminals have been essential to the Ukrainian war effort to help them communicate and coordinate. That's been so important, is Starlink and keeping access to Starlink. A lot of international aid has come that way. There was a Fortnite fundraiser that raised $50 million for Ukraine, and that was March 24th. That's a few weeks into the invasion. And when you look at Zelensky's messages to different governments and different groups of people, they're very finely crafted for the audience that he's giving the talk to. If you looked 2 or 3 weeks into the invasion, he went around and was giving obviously virtual talks. He talked to Congress, he talked to the British Parliament, and they cleverly crafted all of the language to be something that that group of people would be most receptive to. And I'm not dismissing it. It's really smart PR. That's what good leaders do. I mean, if you didn't think Churchill did that type of stuff, he was a master manipulator, trust me. So very, very effective messaging, and it's led to international support, and that's helped the war effort too. Because of all of this, the Russian advance stalled, and they had to pull back and regroup by the end of March, which you can see here. Massive pullback by end of March, early April. Completely left, and a lot of soldiers retreated to either across the border back into Russia or at least into rear positions. This was followed through the late spring and summer months of just more continual operational failures, significant operational failures. This was a river crossing where they probably lost a whole battalion in a river crossing, just poorly executed river crossing. We also know that there's been threats to nuclear power plants. In the early days, the Russians occupied Chernobyl and inflicted quite a lot of damage there, but they had to pull back because they were digging into the soil around the power plant, which is irradiated and cause massive radiation sickness to the soldiers who did it. We know that the Russians have, in occupied areas, forcefully deported local populations, particularly children. We know that's been taking place, deported to Russian territory, which is a war crime. That does classify as a war crime. Also, the war crimes that have taken place. There is ample evidence that those war crimes are taking place, and the number of war crimes being committed is quite high, and it's getting higher. The more territory that the Ukrainians take back, the more these war crimes are. Quite devastating. The summer months were followed by, I won't say a stalemate. It wasn't really a stalemate. The war obviously was transitioning into a more long-term conflict. It wasn't this direct assault and then the reaction to that direct assault. You have the Russians actually do gain ground in April into May and July, particularly in the east and the south. But remember, a lot of that territory was already heavily controlled by these pro-Russian separatists, and a lot of Russian forces invaded over that land. So it's not that the map is misleading in that sense. It's just not that none of that territory was occupied and then all of it became occupied in the war. A lot of it was already effectively controlled by the Russians before the invasion was even launched. Things pretty much stalled into the summer months. Russians did gain some ground in the south because the Ukrainians had to shift, just like the Russians did, had to shift from this operation, mainly concentrating on this operation around the capital, to now grander operations in terms of space and size in the south and in the east. What you should also notice is you can see here the Ukrainians were launching some attacks in the eastern portion of the country, weren't gaining too much ground. They started focusing on the south. And what we know now is that they did this into August because they were trying to convince the Russians that their new initiative was going to be to go straight for Crimea. Turns out that's not exactly what they were doing. In a very, very smart operational move, they, in the summer months, started concentrating their main attention south, launching a lot of attacks south. And then without being too overt about it, they started to withdraw armor very subtly from the south, and they started to shift it north. My students who are in the Vietnam War class, this is sort of similar to what was tried by the South Vietnamese in 75. withdrawing subtly soldiers so that they can be redeployed elsewhere. That's what the Ukrainians did here, is they withdrew armor subtly. They kept up the attacks to make it look like their attention was mostly south. They withdrew some artillery, they withdrew some armor, and then they concentrated it in the north in the Kharkiv region. And then on September 6th, they launched the Kharkiv offensive. And the Ukrainians used something called thunder runs. This is a new operational approach that was in both ways invented by the United States. So Vietnam War students, I didn't mention this when we talked about the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, the United States came up with, well, not the United States, soldiers on the ground who were tank drivers, came up with something called a thunder run. And what would happen is they would go into these territories in these search and destroy missions. They had found that either the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese had mined the areas really heavily. So what they did is they got 2 tanks and they put them on a road or on a path they needed to advance through. And they got side by side and then they drove as fast as they could. And the vibration and the movement of the tanks side by side set off all of the mines. And the idea is that the tanks were reinforced enough, because they were, and they were moving fast enough that they wouldn't be harmed by the mines, but they would set them all off. And they called them thunder runs. So they would do these thunder runs to clear these minefields. Fast forward to the Gulf War, and the United States came up with this new approach. They called it a thunder run, but not the same thing. What a thunder run is you construct an armored column. So you've got armored personnel carriers, you've got tanks, you've got infantry soldiers that are in the armored group. And the idea is that you basically throw a hard punch, you break through the enemy line, and you go so fast and you hit so hard that you get far behind the enemy front line, and you just attack any enemy that you see. And then when you advance far enough, whatever your target is, you turn around, you run back, attacking as you go. And the idea is it's meant to cause chaos. It's meant to be a quick punch, break through the line, advance to a target. You inflict losses really far behind the line, because normally with a front, you've got the frontline troops, you have reserve troops, then you have your logistical infrastructure and all of your command structure back there. They're far behind the line because they're trying to not be attacked so that they can do their job to support the troops at the front. But with a thunder run, you are attacking those troops directly, and it causes chaos. And what it does, if it works correctly, is thunder runs cause the complete collapse of an enemy front, because the enemy is completely confused. They don't know what's going on. They're overwhelmed and they panic and they drop and they run. And that's what a thunder run is. So the Ukrainians executed thunder runs, and it worked incredibly well. They advanced very, very, very rapidly. They took a lot of territory in a short period of time. And what it actually exposed is that the Russians didn't have that reserve and logistical system back behind their front line, because thunder runs aren't going to work if the enemy army can close behind them and encircle them and capture them. And if you have a lot of reserve and a lot of logistical backfill, that's going to happen. If you don't have that, then the whole thing collapses. And there's story after story after story of Ukrainians going into former command posts, and the Russians just dropped everything and they ran. Tons of artillery, some heavy armor was left behind, munitions, weapons, personal belongings of the soldiers just dropped because they panicked so much so quickly that they just basically dropped and they ran. So very effective. That advance is continuing. Thunder runs, though, require surprise. So whether or not they're going to be able to do this again as effectively is a big question mark. We will see. You have the bombing of the Kerch Bridge. We don't know a lot about this yet. It was bombs in the truck. It probably was not something under the water. There's been a lot of debate about that, because right before the explosion, there's some white water under the bridge. I think it was the truck. The explosion to me looks too high to have not been the truck. Everybody seems to agree on that. There was a truck that went over this bridge. This bridge connects the Crimean Peninsula with mainland Russia. It's a sign of Russian reach to Crimea. And the Ukrainians set off a truck bomb. If this was a suicide bomb, this war is entering a whole new phase. When you have people willing to do suicide bombing, you're talking about a new type of war here. We don't know that in this situation yet. There's a lot of debate about that. The Ukrainians, because of the confusion in the north, were able to take advantage of that in the south and continue that offensive. And now they have advanced all the way to Kherson, the city of Kherson. And what you should notice, remember I said geography matters. What you should notice, dynamic topography north of Kherson. What do you notice south of it? Very flat. So if the Ukrainians get across that river, the Russians are not going to be able to stop them, and they will take Crimea. I've seen analysts speculate that if the Ukrainian advance continues as it is, they will have Crimea by the spring. I think that's possible. I don't see anything to indicate that's not possible at this point, especially because geographically, if you try to, and this is not just something about the Russians, by the way, historically speaking, when people have attempted to take Crimea, if they try to take Crimea from the north, it's very easy to do and difficult to stop because there's no natural geographical features that make stopping an advance an easy thing. We know, however, that they are digging trenches in an effort to prepare for that advance. We know that they have bombed a very important hydroelectric dam in the area to prevent the advance. And what we know as of now is that the Russians have suffered. The numbers on this vary wildly. My Vietnam War students, I've told you, data like this is very subjective and it's very politicized. So when you look at casualty numbers for this war, they vary unbelievably wildly. But I would say reliable estimates, the Russians have suffered 80,000 killed in action or more. 80,000 in 6 months. If we're talking about Vietnam, remember the United States suffered 58,220 KIA from 1956 to 1975. The Russians have lost 80,000 in 6 months. Usually what you do is you take the killed in action number, you multiply it by 3, and that's total casualty rate as a standard mathematical average for most wars. They've lost 12 to 14 generals, if not more. And remember, for the Russian command structure, that does not work. It's estimated that 60% of all Russian munitions expended have failed, which means they fired them and they have not exploded. So not only are you having operational failure, but you're having massive technological failure. You have soldiers with no food, no fuel, no clothes, no weapons, being sent to the front with no weapons. That is causing, amongst the Russians, demoralization. It's causing desertion. It's causing sabotage. It's causing fragging. We know that Russian soldiers have killed their own commanders in several situations. It also is contributing to the escalation of war crimes committed against Ukrainians. The war crimes are happening. There's ample evidence for that. People have used the word genocide. We military historians are very careful with the use of that term. That is something that has been investigated and will continue to be investigated. But I would say in terms of war crimes, evidence to me suggests yes, absolutely. We know that separatists are fleeing. So anybody that was pro-Russian or actually Russian in Ukrainian territory has been fleeing the country because they fear what's going to be done to them. And there's actually footage out now of collaborators being arrested and in some cases likely assaulted by the Ukrainians. A lot have been arrested. Some people have disappeared. Collaboration, people that study collaboration in wars, it's a very difficult thing, collaboration. The French for World War II collaborating with the Nazis, the French still have not adequately wrestled with Nazi collaboration. It's still a hot button issue in France to this day. So certainly a hot button issue in Ukraine. Ukrainian casualties, those vary quite wildly, even more than Russian casualties. I've seen numbers reported that the Ukrainians have suffered about 7,000 killed in action, about 20,000 casualties. I've seen 100,000. So it's hard to say. I would say they've probably sadly suffered anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 civilians killed. Most of those in bombings, probably up to 100,000 casualties, but more of those injured as opposed to killed in action. The Russian referendums on seized territory in eastern portion of Ukraine, those were, as you might know, rejected. The Russians tried to mobilize reserves. That went horribly, not only because people fled the country, but also because they don't have a reserve system in place. So they don't have a system in place to call up a bunch of civilians into active duty and then deploy them. That's why it went horribly and why it won't go well again if they try it again. And Putin's promised that he won't do that. Now, of course, he could violate that promise easily, but that would be bad for the civilian population in Russia in terms of his public popularity, because all of this is hurting his popularity. This has also caused the Russians to lose power in the power bloc they formed. The Russians exert a lot of influence on their neighboring states, as you might imagine. At times, they also mediate conflicts between those states. So, for example, there's been a long-running conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And because the Russians didn't have the power to step in and mediate it, violence has broken out again between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You don't much see it in the news because there's other things people are covering, but that has been going on. Putin threatened nuclear deployment, but the United States made it clear that we would retaliate, not necessarily with nuclear weapons. With the state of the Russian military in Ukraine, the United States could retaliate with conventional weapons. They don't need nuclear weapons to retaliate because the Russians can't control the air. I think that was a bluff. And even if it wasn't a bluff, I think US deterrence, along with China and India, the only two big economic powerhouses willing to still do business with Russia, saying, do not use nukes, I think that's dissuaded him. I think it was a bluff anyway, by the way. Of course, it's possible. I don't see it as likely. We can also talk about the difference between a strategic and a tactical nuke. If you've heard the phrase tactical nukes in the news and you want to know what that means, you can ask and I can explain it. The Ukrainians are going to continue their offensive. They've gotten really good at combined arms. They've gotten really good at operational coordination. They care about what they're fighting for. They're fighting hard and they're fighting smart. They're not going to stop, especially not because internationally they're being sent a lot of material. In fact, I've been following, right now we're in the process of refitting old Czech Republic tanks that the Ukrainians can put into action. So we are refitting them. Now, you might say, why not give them American tanks? Well, they're not necessarily trained on American material. Some of it they are, but a lot of it they're not. So it's easier to give them stuff from the former Soviet bloc because they're more familiar with the operational system. So it's just easier. We gave them a bunch of artillery pieces, for example. People had to be sent to Poland for 2-month training programs to be able to use the artillery because the system is different. So it's just easier to give them stuff they're familiar with. So that's why we're outfitting tanks right now. In terms of the international situation, Putin has catalyzed a stronger Ukrainian national identity than he ever would have believed could have existed. A bunch of countries that refused to join NATO previously are probably going to join NATO. Ukraine is likely to become an EU country in the future. The Russian economy, it's not showing cracks in the immediate sense because they're getting cash from India, but mainly China. China is buying the Russian economy as we speak. The more this war goes on, the more Russia has to sell its economy to China, which is not good for the long-term economic stability of Russia. In Russia, the huge battlefield losses cannot be ignored. It's created a lot of civil unrest in Russia. Something people aren't talking about, though, which is a concern, is not only are people speaking out against the war, but there is a growing group of people in Russia who are speaking out against the war because they don't think Putin is being harsh enough. They are war hawks who want Putin to be more aggressive than he's being. And that group is becoming more and more vocal, particularly the Wagner group, which is their big main mercenary group in Russia that the Russian government hires out to a lot. This is likely to cause international food shortages. It really already has. If those grain deals don't stay in place that the Russians and the Ukrainians negotiated, you could have famine in economically disadvantaged countries, in countries where they are very susceptible to this because importation of food is already very difficult. There were 2 people killed in Poland because a rocket went into Poland and struck a small village and killed 2 people. That could have triggered NATO involvement in this war. And if you have NATO involvement in this war, then nuclear escalation is far more likely. So that needs to be avoided. That's why people reacted to that as quickly as they did. How will the war end? I've thought about this a lot. Putin is backed into a corner, and it's very easy for third parties to say to the Ukrainians, negotiate, give up some territory and end the war. Third parties don't have the right to tell Ukrainians what they will and won't fight and die for. If the Ukrainians are willing to fight and die, then that is their decision to make. And third parties don't have the right to dictate that one way or the other. If the United States or other countries that are supporting Ukraine say, okay, enough, find peace, and the Ukrainians say no, they have the power to withdraw financial and military support. But what that could lead to is Russian control of Ukraine, which will be far more punitive than it ever would have been previously. So I think Ukraine is probably going to succeed in taking back a lot of its territory. Never count the Russians out. There have been a lot of times in history where the Russian military has been knocked back and it looks like it's about to collapse, and they've been able to marshal and resurge. So never count them out, but it's not looking well. You're talking about decades of damage to the military, decades of damage to their financial systems. And I think the likely outcome is marked Ukrainian success. How much territory they're able to take versus how much loss they're willing to sustain, I can't answer that, only they can. But we've gone on for a while now, so I want to now turn it over to questions. If anybody has questions, you can put them in the chat, as to have any.
Good afternoon, Professor. I just want to say like thank you. As Ukrainian, it was really like so helpful and so detailed.
Oh,
So
thank you.
just thank you. Thank you a lot.
Is this Daria?
Yeah, it's me.
Hi, yeah. Well, yeah. Well, it's an important conflict. People need to understand it. And if anybody ever says, yeah, you don't need to study military history, this is one reason why studying military history is important, is that you can understand conflicts like this, so they have context. And I've said to my Vietnam War students many, many times that war is not a chess game. It's not pieces on a board. Real people are impacted by this, and no one should ever forget that. And so I think if anybody, this is, I see a lot of the videos on YouTube because I'm following the comments, and I see comments on Twitter. Never forget that what you're seeing isn't just explosions. It's not just troops moving. These are people on both sides of this conflict. And I think people need to remember that. So, let me see. Questions. Nicole, do I think this could escalate to a World War III? If we can keep NATO from directly intervening, yes. If you keep the war in Ukraine, you're not going to have a World War III scenario here. Also, I think that, I saw earlier questions. I'm sorry, they sort of all hit at once. I'm sorry, I'll try to get to them. As long as NATO stays out of it in terms of direct intervention, I think you have every chance of avoiding World War III. I didn't get to say it. If Putin, let's say Putin wants to fire a tactical nuke. Tactical nukes are nukes with a smaller yield. So you have strategic nukes, which are like 500 to 1 million kilotons, okay? 1 million kilotons is equivalent to 1 million pounds of TNT being exploded without the nuclear element. 1 million kiloton nuclear weapon. United States, I think we have between 3,000 and 4,000 strategic nukes. They call them strategic nukes. Bigger yield. The idea is that they're meant to be strategic in the sense they're bigger. Their impact is bigger. Tactical nukes, smaller, 1 kiloton yield to 50 kiloton yield. To give you an idea, Hiroshima was a 15 kiloton yield nuclear warhead. And the reason they're called tactical nukes is that the idea is that you have to deploy them, or you do deploy them in more of a tactical situation. So you're using them in an operation and then conducting operations. So if anybody's familiar with, I'm sorry, everybody. If anybody's familiar with, I think it was called Operation Downfall, which was the plan to invade Japan at the end of World War II, the United States plan. The United States' plan was actually to drop nuclear weapons on the sort of beachfront in a sense, and then US troops would invade over the bombed territory because people didn't really understand nuclear fallout. Scientists understood it intellectually, but people didn't really understand it. So that was actually the plan to invade Japan, was drop nukes, US troops invade over nuked territory. That would be tactical use, is you're using them as basically a bigger version of a conventional. Russia would drop a tactical nuke. However, those nukes that the Russians don't have nukes like ready to fire right now. Okay. They're not what we call wedded to deployment systems. Okay. So we would know they're stored. So we are monitoring what they're doing. We will know if they're moving nukes around. So one, we're going to know that. Two, we also have the ability to interfere with that. Three, I'm not confident that if Putin ordered a nuclear strike, that his soldiers would carry it out. Four, I'm not confident if they carried it out, the nuke would even go off because of how poor some of their stuff is. So I think there's a lot more steps between this war and like global thermonuclear disaster, if we want to use that phrase, than people think. And it's understandable for people to be upset. I get it. I mean, I'm not pleased by that idea either. It's a very scary idea, but I think it's actually more remote of a possibility than it seems, especially because not only have we remained firm on it, but also China and India have outright now said, do not use nukes. And if Russia wants to keep its economy alive, then they need China and India. China, the biggest percentage of trade that China does is with the United States. So relations between Russia and China, as I said, the Chinese are piece by piece buying up the Russian economy. That's how the Russian economy is staying as stable as it is business by business is being bought by the Chinese, or they are selling to the Chinese to get cash because they desperately need cash. The more this war goes on, the more the Russian economy is going to be sold to international players, and that is going to be nothing but devastating to the long-term stability of the Russian economy. But now that this indicates that relationship, it is strong, but it's also very telling that from the beginning, China would not speak out on, they would not use overt language to support what Russia was doing. They wouldn't at first use overt language to denounce it. But, China needs to do business with the West. They know that. So, we are a nuclear deterrent and China is. Was the rest of the world aware that Russia was a paper tiger before the war? No, not really. I mean, well, again, most militaries are paper tigers to some degree, but the degree to which Russia is one, no, in no shape, way, or form. Part of that from the Western perspective, I think, is you sort of see in your potential enemy yourself because you project your fears on the enemy. So you prepare for the worst scenario in the event of a war. So when Russia comes out and says it has a system that's going to defend Russian tanks from any type of like surface to air missile or any type of shoulder mounted missile system like Javelin, if you've heard talks about javelins, or NLAWs, that's the British one, you have to believe that, because the consequences of not believing it are devastating in a military context. But no one predicted that this was going to turn out the way it was, and good for you. What would I say to people in the United States who are pro-Russia? I mean, there is no justification for the military action they're undertaking. All of the reasons given for the invasion are unjustified. The only one that I see the argument to is that NATO, Ukraine becoming a NATO country in important historical territory of Russia, they see as a diplomatic threat to their sovereignty. But that doesn't mean that justifies invasion. I could give a whole talk. Drones shaping the future tactics of war. This has been enormous, drones. There are going to be whole books, there already are books written about drones, but there are going to be whole books written about the use of drones in the Ukraine war. I would say the biggest use of drones, actually, from my point of view, is not necessarily weapons deployment, although that's been important. I think it's observational. I watched a whole report on a tank assault that was conducted, and the commander stayed back. Russian tank commanders are supposed to be in their tanks commanding the tank, but in the Western NATO US system, commanders can be back further. And you might say, well, that's not good. They're not with their soldiers. The commanders are the ones that need to be able to make decisions. Okay, so they need to be able to command and coordinate. It's the US Western NATO system allows for quick succession of authority, but that doesn't mean you want that to happen. You need stability in command. He was back from the front watching the tanks with a drone, coordinating their activities with the drone, and they conducted an incredibly successful tank assault of a Russian position. So observation, monitoring on the ground with people on the ground that know how to use the drones, I think that's actually, in my view, maybe even going to be bigger than the weapons deployment of drones themselves. Impact of the war on neighbors. Belarus, there's been separatist activity in Belarus, people in Belarus who are conducting again, this is all a matter of opinion, depending on whose point of view you're looking at. Either they're committing crimes, or it's an insurgency, or it's a revolution, depending on the point of view, who are starting to act out against the Belarus government. You have separatist movements in several countries around Ukraine that are becoming more active because of this. It's not a bordering country, but if people are interested, look up what's going on in Kazakhstan. It's a really interesting situation there. Lots of fuel shortages in Kazakhstan. There's a huge like expat and historically ethnically Russian population in Kazakhstan. So now people there are very worried about potential future aggression towards their country, which is breaking the historically very close relationship between those two countries. So that's really interesting. So a lot of very, interesting escalating and cascading effects of this war on Russian allies that no one would have expected, certainly not Russia. Recently, even, again, bordering country in a sense, I guess. But, about a month ago, the Russians reached out to Chechnya and said, Chechnya, can you send us more troops? And Chechnya said no. And that's a really big deal, because when the Russians try to conduct operations elsewhere where the laws of war are frequently skirted, a lot of times they use the pro-Russian Chechnyan government to do it, and particularly in Syria. And so that the Chechnyans said no was pretty big break there. So a lot of cascade. Does this situation in Ukraine, China, and Taiwan, I think this war has prevented the Chinese from having serious designs on Taiwan for the immediate future. I'm very convinced of that. If these problems exist in the Russian military, they absolutely exist in the Chinese military. And so, and in this situation, a land invasion is way easier than an amphibious assault on an island. So if you're talking about needing to be operationally effective, then you have to be way more operationally adept if you're China trying to take Taiwan than if you're Russia trying to invade Ukraine. And if these problems exist in the Russian military, they definitely exist in the Chinese military. So, and the fact that the West has reacted as it has, so you've seen China sort of back off some of its extreme rhetoric in the last month or two. A lot of that is because the Russians, the Chinese, anyone in sort of the anti-Western bloc, no one expected the West to react the way it has. And people are starting to take that seriously the longer this war goes on. So I think this has been very good for the sovereignty of Taiwan, at least. I'll keep taking questions, but here's what I want everybody to do to make this easier on me. Do me a favor, type in your class. So if you're in 1212 with me or you're in 3580 with me, then type that into the chat so that I can, record you. And if you have to go, you can go. But if you want to stay and listen to me answer some more of these questions, I will stay and listen to some of these questions, answer. Historical examples similar to this war, and what reflections can we get from these? Well, I mean, the Crimean War, if you took headlines, in some ways, the Crimean War from 1853 to 56 is very similar to this in a lot of ways. People trying to control the Crimean Peninsula, or, and territory beyond that, the Ottomans and the Russians, and then other powers get involved. Implications for the world economy. Well, what it's definitely going to lead to is less reliance on Russian energy in the immediate term. As I said, the Russian economy is going to suffer quite severely, because there's no avoiding that, by the way. No avoiding the toll of, the war on the Russian economy at this point. There's no avoiding that. I think if you're trying to draw long-term lessons, you have to fall back on, do you think war is something humans are always going to engage in, or do you think humans can learn lessons from past wars to avoid future wars? If the former is the case, then the lessons are sort of more immediate and realistic, in the sense that you need to have a better military if you're going to engage in an operation like this. The defensive is way stronger than the offensive. If you care about the cause you're fighting for, and I'm talking about the Ukrainians here, that matters quite a lot. Wars need to not happen in globally agriculturally important regions. The power of international diplomatic and economic pressure, there's lessons there. If you think that you need to learn lessons, then very clearly this war did not need to happen. It was engaged in, I don't think, overwhelmingly for justified reasons. And, you know, all it's led to is not only destruction of Ukraine. I mean, you know, there's young Russians who are being sent into this war that have no idea about this war, and they're dying in this war, and they don't need, that doesn't need to be happening. So lessons there is a little bit more complicated, and but I think when you're talking about lessons of past wars for future wars, it really comes down to what do you believe? Can humans evolve past war, or are humans always going to be, you know, are wars always going to happen? I don't have the answer to that. I would say historical record suggests the former, but optimistically, how would Putin react if the Ukrainians retake Crimea? Yeah, if a tactical nuke were used and it worked, which is possible. I'm not saying it's not. Not a small possibility it wouldn't. Yes, they would be nuking their own forces. Yes, they would be irradiating their own forces. Sorry, people can read the chat. I want to get through some of these, but yes, but clearly the Russians don't really care about that, because they deployed troops around Chernobyl and told the troops to dig into the soil around Chernobyl, and on very quick order, all of them got radiation sickness. So they obviously didn't care too much about that. But I think they would deploy it in a tactical manner. I think they would continue to operate troops around where they had deployed the tactical nuke. But again, at this point, I'm not convinced. Now, if the Ukrainians retake all of Crimea, I don't know. I go back and forth on this. If, you know, I think people have made it pretty clear that they don't want Putin using nukes. And I think the US deterring, along with China and India deterring, has pretty much indicated that that Putin would only resort to tactical nukes if there was some type of invasion of direct Russian territory. Now, again, they've annexed Crimea, but I think Crimea is contested enough that I don't see that. But I can tell you, if the Russians did deploy a tactical nuke, then we would retaliate. And we don't have to retaliate with nukes. So I would think you would see non-nuclear US air retaliation, and it would be unbelievably punitive on the Russians, because the Russians have no ability to not only dominate the air, they don't dominate the air over Ukraine, let alone control it. If anybody here likes to study the Air Force, one thing you've noticed I haven't talked a lot about is the air war. And that's because there really isn't much of one, because the Ukrainians inflicted so many losses so early on Russian air capability, trying to get troops and supplies and control the air over Ukraine, that now they're gun shy. They are really hesitant to deploy anything above the skies, which means they can't control the air. Now, Ukrainians don't have the hardware to control the air either, but you know, the United States would have no problem inflicting really punitive losses on the Russians with conventional weapons if that were the case. The thing about bringing Belarus into the war, I would have been more convinced that Belarus would get involved in the war 4 months ago. Now, with how things have gone, I'm not convinced, especially because he's dealing with increasing political opposition at home because of the support he's already provided. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't know. It was more likely earlier on in the war. I think Belarus, which is, well, look it up and read about it. Belarus I think they are less likely to get involved in the war now than they would have even 3 months ago, because of how poorly things have gone. At the end of the day, the alliance constructed by Putin is not an alliance of like mutual respect and friendship. It's a fear alliance. And usually what happens in fear alliances is they break down very quickly when that alpha bulldog starts to show weakness. That's why you're having all of these former bloc states that were close to Russia. Now they're breaking off and they're not doing what Russia wants. They're not listening to Russia. They're openly speaking out against Russia in some cases. And I think, the administration in Belarus at the end of the day is going to be out to protect itself over Russia. So I see that as less likely now. There have been conflicts in neighboring states. That's hard to say. I haven't followed that quite as closely, more to the southwest. But, I think what all of this is showing is that when you have an alliance that's constructed purely through fear, and sort of economic benefit that's absent of any type of sort of more idealistic ideological ties. Those alliances fall apart very quickly when sort of the alpha in that relationship shows weakness. And that's that. And someone could say I'm being partial by describing it that way, but that the evidence, I think, speaks for itself. It's falling apart. All of the countries that are in the former bloc speaking out against Russia, they're angry Russia, like the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict that's broken out again. Both countries have spoken out about how Russia, can't do anything about it and how they don't appreciate that. Kazakhstan's pulling away. Chechnya is pulling away. I never would have thought that could happen in 2020, that Chechnya would openly, publicly tell the Russian government, we're not going to support what you're doing right now. It's had, this loss has had a really big effect. Mercenaries. This is a really interesting question, Zhang. So when you're dealing with mercenaries, monitoring their behavior is very, very difficult. And then if you're talking about international law, how exactly laws of war apply to them is very difficult as well, because they are not technically soldiers of the state. They are independent entities. And this is actually how, a lot of countries have, if we want to use the phrase, gotten away. A lot of countries have gotten away with committing war crimes that don't directly tie to their state, is because they have hired third parties who then undertake that action for them. So the Wagner Group, for example, I want to pronounce it like a German, the Wagner Group in Russia, which is their big mercenary company. They have several, but that's their big one. Notorious for committing war crimes in Syria, for example. I think that if you are a soldier on the battlefield fighting for a power, you are subject to the same international rules and regulations as that power. So I don't care if it's farmed out. If they're committing war crimes, the Russian government, as far as I'm concerned, is guilty of those war crimes. Similarly, this has been an issue that has been reported, is that there are people from other countries who have gone to Ukraine to fight for Ukraine. And there have been reports that the Ukrainian government has worked to confirm. We don't know about those yet. There hasn't been as much research on that I've seen, is that in some instances there have been war crimes alleged by those individuals. In my view, the Ukrainian government is responsible for that. If these people are fighting for Ukraine under the Ukrainian flag, even as a proxy, then they are responsible for, the government is responsible for the behavior of those soldiers. It's the government's duty to dismiss those soldiers if they suspect that behavior, and then prosecute them for war crimes if they've committed them. Far more isolated instances, execution of prisoners is abuse and execution of prisoners is the main allegation that I've seen. So, that's what I would say about that. The thing about war crimes is that what international law says is a war crime is not always in line with what people morally consider a war crime, in the sense that people morally consider acts war crimes that aren't necessarily legally considered war crimes. If you are a mercenary fighting for a country, you are subject to the same laws and international rules about war crimes as that country is, and you should be punished accordingly. That's my statement on that. I think I got all the questions. If anybody posed a question and still here and I didn't answer it. So, yeah, Zhang, there's a lot of really good articles about the economic implications of the war. I really think it showed us the interconnectedness of international markets. And this is something I've been contemplating, after Napoleon, ran roughshod over Europe, my 12 students. After Napoleon ran roughshod over Europe, Europe had to decide how to deal with France. And they had to decide, can you deal with an economically integrated Europe, an economically integrated and successful world without France? Can you do that? And then after World War II, the Allies had to ask the question, can you have a successful global economy without an economically integrated Germany? Can you have a successful global economy without an economically integrated Japan or Italy? Or how do we deal with the Soviet Union? Can you have independent market there? And then, of course, after World War I, right, dealing with Germany, can you have Europe without an economically integrated Germany? And this is the question people have to ask. This war is going to end. And no matter what at the end of it, the Russian economy is going to be devastated for the long term. And the Ukrainian economy is going to be devastated because of the toll of the war. It's being propped up pretty well through international trade agreements and international aid. But, the immediate impulse of a lot of people is probably going to be, let's punish Russia. Let's kick Russia out of the international economic sphere as punishment for this war. That's going to be the impulse of a lot of people. And as much as people emotionally might want that, I don't think you can do that. I think if you want to use historical examples as a lesson, Europe recovered fairly quickly after Napoleon because France was integrated really quickly back into the international economic sphere. One big reason amongst many that World War II happened is because Germany was punished punitively after World War. Yes, exactly, Rachel. Treaty of Versailles being far too harsh. That was done purposefully to keep Germany on its knees economically. They knew the reparations were too high. They knew the sanctions were too harsh. They knew taking away the military was too far. They did it on purpose to put Germany on its knees for the long term. And the question you have to ask, can you have a successfully integrated continent? Can you have a successfully integrated globe with a major economic player being knocked out for the long term? And the answer to that question, I think, is no. So as much as some people, not all people, but as much as some people might want Germany or might want Russia punished very harshly economically into the far future, as tempting as that might be to some, I don't think that's the right outcome. I think both countries have to be recovered because we're globalized now. There's no reversing it. The world is globalized, okay? Economies are internationally interdependent. There's no reversing that. It's done, okay? So you cannot have a successfully global economy if the biggest country in the world is economically isolated and so disadvantaged that it can't interact. So I think that's, if we're talking about international markets, that's something to think about. And it's going to last, even if harsh sanctions aren't imposed, the economic fallout of this is going to last because Europe spent 2 decades increasing its economic interdependence on Russia, particularly as it applies to energy. They're reversing all of that, and they're not likely to reverse that trend in the near future. And one of Russia's big moneymakers internationally, other than diamonds, is energy. And, the Chinese don't need a ton of energy from Russia. India doesn't need a ton of energy from Russia. So, short-term vengeance has to be set aside and people have to keep the long view. So I think that's, if we're talking about markets and recovering of markets, that's something to think about. But there's a lot of good stuff written about that, particularly the Wall Street Journal, Zhang. If you want to follow the Wall Street Journal, there's a lot of stuff written about that, about economics. That was the end of that Q&A session. I hope this lecture has been informative regarding the war in Ukraine. It's essential to follow these events because they are heavily impacting the world that we live in right now. It's also further justification for why studying military history is so important, because that context and that background and those analytical tools help us better understand the ongoing conflict and how it can impact our everyday lives. I recommend everyone use what they've learned here to continue to follow the war in Ukraine, because it is and will prove to be one of the defining conflicts of our time. As always, have a good day.